Hello and welcome to the EDHRECast, where we're all about Commander, data, and dad jokes. I'm Joey Schultz, and I'm joined by my fantastic co-host. He's here to talk with me about the Dana. It's Data Roach. Or, wait, no, the other way around. Anyway, hey, bud.
One thing I really find interesting over the holidays is like the different regional names you find for different things. Like I had no idea that in Arizona, they just called a snowman a puddle. So like that's kind of cool. Just depending on where you are, different things get known by different names.
Is it at least a puddle? Like there's one big part of the puddle, and then above it a smaller part, and then above that one an even smaller part. And is there a carrot in that last one?
Sad little carrot there in the puddle of water. Yeah.
Yeah, all right. Well, Dana, hey, what are we talking about between the two of us on this week's episode?
We're doing our year-end, we tracked our games. We're talking about the stats from the games we tracked in 2024.
Heck yeah. We did a similar episode to this last year, tracking all of our games. This time, we've got 2 years of data to look at. We tracked all of our games of 2023. Now we've tracked all of our games of 2024. This is one of my favorite yearly episodes that we do. I'm really excited to get into it. We got some stuff to say before we get into the main topic, though.
First up, the show is being brought to you by Cardsphere, our favorite way to turn our unplayed Magic cards into played Magic cards. I have 2 packages on their way to me right now with cards that I'm going to use to tweak decks so I can up that win percentage just a little bit here. So if you click on the link in the video description and the show notes below, you can check them out at cardsphere.com. Celebrate the new year with Cardsphere. See, there's another free slogan for you, Cardsphere. I'm helping out in so many ways.
Dana, are you going to come up with a new slogan for them every single week? That seems like a hard job, dude.
Yeah, I've done it twice. Let's see if I can do it 3 times.
All right. We also want to let you know that this show is brought to you by our fantastic patrons. And if you want to support the show, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast. There are also free ways to support the show, leaving us a review, liking and subscribing on YouTube. All of that means so much to us. It really keeps the show going, keeps the lights on here, allows us to do what we do and bring these fun videos to all of you. But yeah, that is patreon.com/EDHRECast if you want to support the show. And there are tons of cool perks over there, from access to our Patreon Discord to our historic Challenge the Stats spreadsheet. And of course, one of our favorites, our patron shout out of the week. Dana, who are we shouting out on this episode?
This week we are shouting out Sarah Buck. I'm assuming the founder of the Milwaukee Bucks basketball team. So Sarah, myself, and Giannis, thank you for your contributions to the world of the NBA.
Sarah, the buck really stops with you, doesn't it? All right, Dana, let's get into our topic here. So last year, we made a video about how we had logged all of our games of 2023, and that was a super fun video to do. Link in the description, of course. It was really awesome to go over our game data to discover, how well our decks do, our overall win percentage, and get a closer look at like which decks we play the most or least and why. I also tracked a couple of extra things like game length to see how long do games actually go, as well as how do games actually end, such as by combat or mill or life loss, things like that. We even had a bonus video on the channel if you wanted even more data from my deep dive on my game log, if you're interested in that. But we're back at it again this year, and we have even more data to cover.
Well, Joey, you have even more data to cover. I have roughly the same amount of data I had last year in that despite my best intentions to want to track a lot of the things that you tracked, I only made it through probably January, and then I'm like, this is just too much. I'm just going to keep track of the wins and losses and stuff. So yes, you have much more interesting stuff than I do, but I know I said I was going to do more this year, and I didn't. I will set a goal. I'm going to sit down and make a usable on my phone spreadsheet to make it a little bit easier for me to keep track of it this year. So my goal again next year is to have more data than just wins and losses.
I mean, let's be real, Dana. This project isn't easy.
Yes.
I know that we sometimes do get comments of like, oh, why aren't you tracking this as well as that or whatever? And it's just like, it's already a lot. And I did add one more thing to my data tracking this year. I did start tracking how often player 1 wins versus player 2 versus player 3 versus player 4, stuff like that. I actually did try and get like seat position. How did that affect things? Which is a data point I'm really eager to share with all of you. But it does kind of take the mickey out of you just a little bit. It's like, okay, well, this is a lot of stuff to track when I'm just trying to focus on a game with my friends.
Yes. Well, and it requires you to stick around, like if you're playing somewhere at a Magic Con or something, then you have to stick around to gather that data after the game's over. You can't just leave and go do something else. And, if you're playing 75 games a year, it's one thing to track that. When you're playing like 300 games too, it becomes
it's a lot.
easy to just do the simple things. And that's what I wound up doing this year again.
Totally get it. For anyone else out there interested in a similar type of project, take that lesson from us. It's actually kind of a lot sometimes, but we at least get to talk about it on a show. But like this is a hard project to do for a whole bunch of folks. So focus on what helps you have the most fun. And for me, this has eventually become fun, but getting those habits in place in the first place was definitely a little bit difficult. We do have a lot of new data to get through, and I'm excited and curious about how it compares to last year's. But there's one other thing that we probably have to say up front here, Dana. The year's not over. Why are we doing this episode now?
I mean, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was convenient in that like Matt wasn't available this week. So like, if we're going to do a 2-person episode and Matt doesn't track this data, it just made sense to do a 2-person episode. We're already a ways into December with the holidays coming up. There's just not that many times to play.
Yeah.
I actually am playing with friends all weekend this weekend, so I will probably rack up another 12 to 15 games, but I probably will not be playing much more beyond that, and I'm guessing you're kind of in the same boat.
I don't anticipate more than like maybe 2 games for the rest of this year. Quick editor's note from future Joey here. Dana actually only got an additional 3 games in this year, and I only got 2 additional games in this year. Just wanted to provide that quick update. And given our schedules, some life stuff, especially the holidays, plus we saw that everyone was doing their Spotify Wrapped this year, and we got a little bit jealous. We really want to be part of that conversation. Like, if we miss a game or 2 here, which we will count in next year's version of this episode. This is something that we do want to, give as a gift to folks out there for the holidays, because it's a lot of really fun information. And I think that there's something really interesting that you can learn from all of these things. It isn't just about winning and losing. I mean, that's something that we do want to discuss, but tracking other stuff like how did games end and knowing how that will affect the way that you build your decks going forward. Like, how popular is it to win with combat damage or mill or infect?
Sure.
Or how do things like fast mana, turn 1 Soul Ring affect who wins the game? Does player 1 have a higher probability of winning than player 4? How long do games actually go? Do they actually last 10 or 11 turns, or are games closer to like 7 or 8 turns? Lots to get to. Let's start with some basic stuff first, though, Dana. So this year in 2024, I think we'll just start with the total number of games that we played. Last year, I played 217 games in 2023. Do you think I played more or less in this year? Unfortunately, it's less. I only got 141 games in 2024. So a little bit lower, but, it was a busy year. Don't know what to say.
I had 338 games in 2023. And this year I'm at 318. So I'm going to guess after this busy weekend, I'll probably roughly be at the same amount as I was last year in the, the mid 330s to the mid 340 range.
Okay. That's a lot more games. I regret that I am not stacking up to the same number of games that you managed to play. But that's how it goes, I guess.
And I'm in a situation where like I have an LGS that's, minutes from where I live that I can go to on the same commander night every week. And there's, 50 to 100 people in there playing EDH. It's a perfect situation. Like, I can very easily go every week and get half a dozen games in with a different pod every single time. A lot of people aren't in that situation. Right. So I live in a place where I'm very fortunate with regards to just getting a ton of games in.
And that's actually something that I believe should be kind of an undercurrent for most of the rest of this episode, is the places that we are playing. You play a lot more against strangers than I do. I tend to have more commonly than going to LGSs, which I do occasionally, or playing at cons and stuff like that, which is, again, very occasionally. I do tend to have more dedicated friend groups, and including my family. I play against my family as well. So it'll be like, family time, played some games during Thanksgiving, for instance, and then a dedicated group of friends here in Seattle, another group of friends a little bit farther south, stuff like that. So, but those do tend to be some pretty dedicated pods, and that's different than having the dynamic of nearly always seeing different people whenever you do go to your local game store. And that, I think, is kind of my way of rolling into. So those were the total number of games. What was the win percentage, and what can we learn from that? How often did you win this year?
So we talked last year. I was, I think, around 40% last year, and it's like, that's a little higher than I was comfortable being. So I did tweak a few decks downwards. And I won a higher percentage this year. I won 44% of my games this year.
Dana, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
That's kind of a lot, buddy. Real quick, I'll say mine here as well. My win percentage from 2023 was 33.6%. I won 73 out of my 217 games last year. Mm-hmm. My win percentage this year was very similar. It was 34.75%. I won 49 of the 141 games that I've played this year, which I guess overall makes my total average about 34% of the 358 games that I've played over the past 2 years. In a Commander game, we do have that expectation that like 4 players, usually you expect the average to be close to, a quarter of games. Yeah. You're approaching 50%. And I think that's something for us to, give some air to. We know that we're good at Magic. So like, I am glad that both of us have a little bit higher than that. Maybe it feels like we have a little bit of credibility in terms of knowing what we're talking about. But like, what is the type of number that would make you feel like, is my win percentage too high? And I guess that's something that we should pause to, give some discussion to.
So this is, I think, this is the third or fourth time we've done this. It's at least the third time. We definitely did last year. Then at least one previous year we talked about it. And every time we've had these shows, I have intentionally gone through and like tweaked decks down. I remember the first time we talked about it, at least, my Recce History of Kamigawa deck had a pretty high win percentage. So I went through and pulled a couple of cards out that were like, oh, this is a pretty strong card. I can replace Umezawa's Jitte with something else. It's a generically strong card. I can just run something else in there in that slot that's not as powerful. So I made a few changes like that. Over the years, I've quit running tutors almost entirely. I've started
same.
I pulled out Cyclonic Rift years ago and started pulling Rhystic Study is in Smothering Tide. They're the next things I've taken out. I'm pulling things like that from my decks too. And I'm still like my win percentage has still gone up a couple slots every year, it feels like. I feel like I'm in a weird position now where like I don't know what I really necessarily do aside from intentionally running worse versions of like efficient cards. I'm notorious for loving things like Night's Whisper for draw spells in black. I could run worse versions of those and do things like that. I'm not sure if I want to do that though.
Right, that doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, and I tend to run pretty like unassuming commanders as well. It's not like I'm winning decks with like the Dragon or Lathril or any of like our really popular commanders in the list. So I've kind of just resigned myself. Like people don't seem upset with me necessarily about my win percentage when I'm playing them or my decks. I don't really encounter situations where people feel like I'm playing something stronger than the pod. I've just come to the conclusion that I play a lot of Magic. 300 plus games in the last 2 years. That's going to give me an edge. The analogy I use is we're all kind of those kids in high school whose parents had a pool table in the basement. And when you play pool against them, they're just going to have an edge. And I think that's just the situation we're in. We have a pool table in our basement in terms of EDH, and that is going to let us win games to the point where there's maybe nothing you can do about it.
I understand that metaphor and that position. I'll say for myself, if my number was approaching 50% or closer to 1/2 than to 1/4 in a 4-player game, I'd personally have discomfort with that. Sure. And like, I don't mean to demonize winning games. Winning is awesome. And importantly, you and I have different contexts here. Mm-hmm. Dana, you play with total strangers at LGSs a whole lot more than I do. Sure. And crucially, like win percentage is an interesting figure for us to have tracked, but it's just one figure among many that actually helps us clue into the real important thing, which is, are people enjoying these games? So if people are enjoying the games that you're playing, then that's what really matters. Win percentage can help us notice different trends and stuff like that to help us make sure that the games are enjoyable, but they are not the end-all be-all number about whether those games actually were enjoyable. It's more of something that just hopefully helps us check our habits. And kind of going off of that, I think a big ingredient to this also comes down to which decks we're playing the most often too, and where we play them. So sure. For instance, some of my best decks of the year are ones that I actually ended up playing super infrequently. So it's not just about what goes into our decks, but where we play them and how the table receives them. But I think we can break down our specific decks in the latter half of this episode, because now that we've got our bearings, I think the most interesting and actionable data we have for listeners in this episode has to do with things like fast mana. Does a turn 1 Soul Ring improve your win percentage or not? Or player seeding order and whether going last hurts your win chances? Or how long games typically go and how games usually end? Those are the things that I think are most interesting and most useful for listeners for their decks. So how about we jump into some of those? And Dana, let's start with the newest thing in our data this year, tracking player order. Did going first or last or second or third affect player win percentage at all? And before we even say the figure, Dana, I want to send it to you. I want to ask you, what would be your guess about that?
So I'm really looking forward to actually tracking this myself next year, and following through and doing that versus just doing it for like 3 weeks and being like, this is too much.
It's a lot, yeah. It's a lot to track.
So I'm curious what mine look like next year, but my guess would be like there's a minor difference, but I would assume the first player would win a couple percentage points more frequently than the other 4 players. Maybe the person in the 4th seat would win slightly less, but I would guess it's not noticeable.
So, listeners out there, hold your guess in your head, and then I'll tell you some numbers. And Dana, I mean, yeah, you're basically right. It's not very noticeable. So in 2023, I did track just how often going first won games. I didn't track all player positions. That was too much for me at the time. But in 2023, I did see that going first, the average win was 26% of games. So like a slight nudge. But then here in 2024, it was the player going first won 23.4% of the time. The player going second won 27% of the time. Player going third was 26.2%, and the player going fourth was 24.6%. I did also have a small handful, like I played like 7 games that were 5 players. Throughout none of them did the 5th player end up winning that game. But again, 7 is a really tiny sample size, so I'm not investing a whole lot in that necessarily compared to the rest. Even one win among there throws all these numbers completely out of whack. So yeah, we've got basically what, as you kind of said, a rounding error. These are very negligible numbers, and
Sure.
I did not see in my games across the past year a huge significant shift depending on your seat position.
It's never felt that way. Like, you know, if I'm not sure how useful the how something feels metric is. It's never felt like an advantage to go first or a huge disadvantage to go fourth. But seeing the numbers, that's good to know that there's a reason it hasn't felt that way, because it doesn't seem like there really is for the most part.
Yeah, there's possibly, if people really wanted to read into some of these numbers, you could potentially make the excuse that going first draws more attention to you because you play your big threat before other people do. But I don't think that really necessarily bears out, especially because the year previous, my first player percentage was 26%. Like, this is all kind of averaging out to be roughly the same that we expect. Mm-hmm. In more competitive circles, I have to assume that going earlier gives you a significantly bigger advantage in games where, the things will end on like turn 4 or 5 or something like that. Having even one more turn in those types of situations and that end of the format, I think will have a huge difference. But when we're spreading it out across a whole lot of turns in a more casual or a little bit high powered, but certainly not competitive setting, what I'm seeing is a pretty negligible amount in numbers. So that is a thing that I wanted to mention here. But I also think that's an interesting segue to the number of turns that we have. If I'm not playing in those more competitive circles where games might end on turn 3 or 4, how long do games actually go in the games that I'm playing? How long do you think games are? And Dana, I'll throw a question back to you. Did you track turns in your games this year at all?
I literally just tracked the wins and losses. So I didn't. And I think I mentioned in the first half here, I guess most of my games go 8 to 9. Occasionally I'll have one that goes forever. That just happens sometimes. I had one this week that we spent almost 3 hours playing a single game. And it was action. It didn't feel like a 3-hour game. It was filled with action. It was just one of those games that like no one could turn the corner. But I would say on average 8 to 9 is, and I'm going to guess you're probably in that same range.
I mean, basically, yeah. In 2023, my data was that the game seems to end on average at about like turn 9.4, although the first KO of the game usually happened around turn 8.1. But here in 2024, the figure that I found is that the game ended on about turn 9.8, and the first KO was on turn 8.3. I gotta be honest, I kind of expected the format to maybe get faster even over time. I think that's something that we've kind of noted is like watching mana costs slowly go down, the average mana values in decks. We've done episodes in the past seeing that like it does trend downwards as cards get more and more efficient and a little bit of power creep enters. But I saw a gentle uptick, not anything significant. These are still like within rounding errors of being very, very similar to each other, but a slight increase went up there from 9.4 last year to 9.8 this year. About 10 turns between, on round 9 or on round 10. Seems like things are squarely falling in line with where you kind of expected them to be. Kudos.
I would be curious if there was any change in game length pre or post Mana Crypt and Jewel Lotus banning. Did you happen to see that at all or look at that?
I didn't track specifically that moment necessarily, but I am personally willing to bet that, a significant amount of this change could be the result of the fast mana ban of Mana Crypt and Jeweled Lotus. Because I did actually average out those games where fast mana was present, and that's another figure that I'm interested in letting people know about. But in games where fast mana was present, independent of whether those decks won and stuff, those games were a full turn faster when there was a Jeweled Lotus, a Mana Crypt, a Soul Ring on turn 1. Those games ended on turn 8.3, and the first KO was on turn 7. And that was roughly true for both 2023 and for 2024. And so I assume that like partway through this year, having 2 fewer fast mana pieces in the format probably did have a small effect on my numbers here. And I think that could be partly responsible for why I saw that gentle uptick in terms of game length.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would say, again, I didn't track this, but going on feeling, those, particularly the real powerful CEDH style fast mana pieces, when I would see them show up in more casual pods, and Jeweled Lotus and Crypt tended to be the ones that showed up versus like a Mox Diamond or something, it felt like the person was playing a turn or two ahead of everybody else. And getting to that point in the game where they were able to actually, put away a win a turn or two faster than everybody else too. So I would bet that feels right. In a casual setting, those cards, if you have access to them early, that does speed everything up you're doing by about a turn.
I mean, it's called fast mana for a good reason. But another thing to note here, too, it wasn't just about like how much faster those specific turns were when those games ended, but also the frequency at which I saw those pieces also went down a lot this year. There was a dramatic drop in fast mana frequency, probably one of the bigger changes for me to note between the previous years. In 2023, I saw fast mana in 17% of the games that I played. But here in 2024, only 8.5% of the games that I play had them. And, some of those were a Jeweled Lotus, a Mana Crypt on turn 1, but then there were also a couple of Soul Ring moments. There were not a ton of moments where I saw fast mana throughout this year. And again, I'm tracking percentage here, not just total games here. But yeah, the percentage did go down from 17% to 8.5%.
One thing I know you did track too this year was the turn that the first person was knocked out, the first KO of the game.
Yes.
What was that in relation to the average turn length for you? How close was that?
They were usually about a turn apart, which is also what I saw in the previous year. Combining all of the data together across 2023 and 2024, when I total all of that, the average game length that I see tends to be the game total goes about 9.5 turns, but the first KO happened on like turn 8.2. So there tends to be, and again, this is just an average. There are going to be plenty of games that you play out there where this will not be true.
Sure.
But after one person dies, it tends to be pretty quick that another person is going to follow right behind, if not the entire game going out completely behind that too. So that tends to be the staggering that I see, is that like after one person's out, it usually takes about a turn, maybe a round and a half before the game ends up being over.
Sure.
Again, I've got plenty of games in my own deck history. I'm pretty sure I saw a game this year where someone died on turn 6 and then the game went to turn 17. Like, I've got some extremes that will definitely contradict this. Averages mean nothing to the individual person, but that is kind of an interesting thing that I wanted to shout out here, is that, like, yeah, the first KO around turn 8 or so, which is important to note when you're, tinkering with your decks and tuning stuff up. When are you expecting people to die? How fast are these games? Don't count on them going to turn 12, because I don't think most games end up actually getting that far.
What's interesting about this is this was a conversation that did come up at my LGS recently, was we were talking about just the things that have changed in Magic, and someone else mentioned this, but I think it's a valid point. 6-8 years ago or so in our shop, people that were like buying singles would oftentimes go up to the counter and buy their singles for the week that they had wanted after they got knocked out of a pod. So like that first KO would happen and they'd like, okay, well, I've got 15 minutes to kill before, there's a game available, so I'm going to go buy my singles and take care of my business, that kind of stuff. Everyone buys their singles at the end of the night or the start of the night, because that's really not how games feel like they work anymore. You might get knocked out, but the game tends to wrap up then pretty quickly from that point on. I definitely think that is an observable change in how EDH games play out compared to 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago, where just because someone got knocked out doesn't mean the game was going to end. And I think these days, once that first domino falls, the rest tend to fall pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think that does kind of speak to a little bit of the acceleration of the format in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think these numbers are important to hold in your mind as well, because when we think casual deck, what do we think that means? And like, when do we think games will actually end, and what does it mean to not be quite as casual or whatever. Sometimes it is just the decks of mine that can win even one turn faster than that are actually pretty high power. And it's just like, yeah, kind of an interesting thing to hold in your mind about like, how fast is the deck really? If you're playing a deck and you notice that the game ends around round 8 or 7, it's probably faster on average than most others. And that's a thing for us to keep in check and clock about our own deck's capability so that we hold ourselves accountable to them and that we're not, accidentally stomping or anything like that.
So you saw a decrease in the amount of fast mana that you saw. Did you see a change, though, in the win percentage of decks that had access to fast mana out early in the game?
No. Short answer is a definite no. So last year I saw fast mana win approximately 46% of the games where it was present. A person who had a turn 1 Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, whatever, won nearly half of the time. And again, my sample size there is very, very tiny. I do not think that this is necessarily the case for every play group that is out there. There are plenty of folks who have a different experience. This year, it was basically the same rigmarole. Of the 12 games that I saw this year that had a fast mana piece on turn 1, 6 of those games were won by those players. So it's, again, an even 50%. And if I'm totaling it out across both of those years, the fast mana win percentage is nearly 47% of the time that I saw a fast mana piece, the person with that fast mana piece then won that game, whether it was a turn 1 Soul Ring into a Signet or a Mana Crypt, which obviously isn't going to happen as much anymore. But like, that is still a thing that I am observing in my games, that fast mana is good. It's good, y'all. Don't know what else to say. Okay. Going over figures like this, I kind of wonder if that will, I mean, obviously 2 of these pieces that had come up in some of these games are no longer in the format, but that was obviously its own big piece of drama. I guess I wonder if that's a topic that we linger on here for a moment to be like, oh, does this have any effect on our evaluations or not? Is this, when it comes to the fast mana, is this even a figure that we have a lot of strong feelings towards or not? I think that's maybe something that we pause for in this discussion when looking over numbers like this.
So for me personally, your stats themselves show that half of the games where somebody had fast mana out, that player won the game. For me, I like the idea that we have less things that if you drop it on turn 1, it puts you in that 50% win rate. I seeing these stats make me comfortable with a banning I was already pretty comfortable with. Now, I say that as someone who won a bunch of games, right? Like I take that with a grain of salt. That's just me in my particular situation. But like I think that makes the bans continue for me to feel like a good idea for the format as a whole.
Interesting. It's so funny. This is my own data, but I'm still like, yeah, I don't think that these needed to be banned. So like,
sure.
Because like crucially for me is that like the places I was playing my games were not CEDH games. And those cards in CEDH games are a completely different equation and a lot more regular. And so like that's for me, I'm looking over these figures and I'm like, this is a very Joey data set, and I don't want people to take away the message that this is true for everybody is the main thing that I think I want to linger on here. These are numbers that I encountered that I don't speak for you. I'm not the Lorax. You are not the trees. So that is just a thing that I kind of wanted to mention there, I guess. And it is interesting that like, I think it would be easy to just look at these numbers and assume that therefore it wasn't a fun game.
Right.
And that isn't the case. I had very, very, very like maybe 2 total instances this past year where I was like, that game wasn't great. And for one of those instances, it was because I played a deck that was too powerful for everybody else. So that was my own dang fault. Like, so like that is the quality is much more important to look at for the individual games rather than just like looking at numbers and then broadly making a gesture about the quality of those games. That's the thing I want to make sure that we don't accidentally do. So anyway, I think that was probably just, worth dwelling on for a moment.
Well, so talking about winning games here, one of the things I know you kept track of this year was like how in particular games ended. Like what did people use to close them out? Was it, combat or combo or alt-win? What was it? And this, if I track nothing else next year, this is something I want to make sure that I keep track of because I think this is kind of fascinating. What were your numbers here that jumped out at you?
Yeah, get ready, everyone. This is a lot of information. So in 2023, I did track how games ended, and we had a pie chart for that. And I'll probably do like a side-by-side pie chart here. And again, this is how the games ended specifically, not how everyone died in a game, but like how the last hit of the game, how a game finally came to a close. And let's just pull up those pie charts. They're going to look very, very similar to each other. There's a slight shift, but not by a huge amount. The main way that games ended by far is just straight up combat damage. Your overwhelming stampede, crater hoofy type of situation, just having a lot of creatures in play that overwhelm your opponent in a combat step. Last year in 2023, 53% of games that I saw ended via combat. This year it was 59% of games ended that way. So combat is a pretty popular way to win. There was also stuff like life loss or burn, your exsanguinates or your terror of the peaks, direct damage, a different way that isn't combat of making your opponent's life total get to 0. Last year, I saw about 30% of games won that way. And then this year, about 24%. So a good quarter of games seemed to end in, the blood artisty or, mono red damagey kind of way. And the rest of possible win conditions, combo, alt win con, infect, mill, commander damage, Dana, they're pretty dang tiny. They do not occupy a huge part of that pie chart.
Yeah, I'm actually a little bit surprised combo was as low as it was, although I don't see a ton of games end with combo for me either. I would guess we're probably outliers here. I think we tend to play in environments where people just don't play combo because we don't play combo. I would bet the average person sees more combo wins than the 2% of games that you saw, and I would guess probably roughly the equivalent for me as well.
Yeah, that's very, very fair, I think. So going over some of those specific numbers, I saw 4 games end this year due to combo, or in fact, I saw 1 game. Mill, I didn't see any mill wins in 2023. I saw 2 games end due to mill here in 2024, but we're talking like combo 2.8%. Of games were ended that way. Alt win conditions, things like Approach of the Second Sun. I actually count in, I won a game due to Door to Nothingness this year. Alt win conditions were like 3.5% of games this year. In fact, less than 1%. I saw one game where poison was how the person won the game overall. Mill was 1.4%. Honestly, the only highest one aside from combat and life loss was commander damage wins. Specifically, commander damage is the reason that the game ended in the final beat of that game. 11 games, which is 7.8% of games this year. Compared to last year, it was about 6.5%. Like, a lot of these figures are extremely, extremely similar to the previous years from 2023 versus 2024. And when totaling them all up, we'll get a big average pie chart on screen. It really is like, yeah, a lot of games end due to combat in some way. Even in some cases, infect or commander damage are also versions of combat. So what I'm saying, people, is that when we say play more fogs, we've done a whole episode about play more fogs.
Sure.
When we say that, this is why.
Yeah, and I think this is something too that's changed in Magic over the years. There was a point in time where, obviously Crater who's been around a long time, Overwhelming Stampede, etc. But once upon a time, aside from combo or having to draw your Crater Hoof, a lot of people their win condition for a deck was have a 4/4 in play when someone was at 3.
Yeah,
and that was like how you planned on closing out a game. There's just so many cards printed these days that enable whatever your deck is doing. How many cards double the amount of +1 counters on creatures you control compared to what was available 7 years ago.
Sure.
Red has a whole suite of damage doublers now that, once upon a time it was gratuitous violence or go home. There's just so many win conditions that exist out there that I think that, number one, makes combat much more attractive and much easier to win with than maybe it once was. And it just makes everything else, just the amount of kind of shrapnel exploding around the average table dealing damage to people. I think that's why you also don't have the thing we talked about where the one person gets bumped out and then no one else loses for 20 minutes or a half hour. Why that's no longer quite the thing like it once was. I look at even cards I just added Midnight Snack to a deck, a card from Foundations. It's an enchantment that has raid at the beginning of your end step. If you attack this turn, you make a food token, but you can sacrifice it for 2 and a black, and a target opponent loses X life for X amount of life you gained this turn. Again, in a life gain deck of some sort, there's situations a lot of them where you just kill somebody with that card.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of cards that do those kind of things now in ways that just didn't. So the face of the game, I think, has really changed in that regard too. There's just a lot of cards that in your specific deck, they'll kill somebody if you drop them at the right point in the game. And that's relatively new, I think.
And again, I'm only counting the last hit of the game.
Right.
I'm not counting all of the ways that players died. It's possible that there are games where two players were knocked out via combat damage, but then the game was won by a blood artist. So there's definitely that thing to be aware of, to pay attention to. But 2/3 of my games from the past 2 years, when I'm totaling them all up, 2/3 of the games that I played from the past 2 years ended because of some type of combat scenario, whether it was commander damage, combat damage, an alt win condition like Strixhaven Stadium, things like that, or a big creature with infect. Some of those are a little bit more rare than others, but combat is ingrained in a whole lot of the strategies here. So if you're playing a fog, it's possible that you're blanking an entire big turn in a really crucial way. So these are the types of figures that I think do play a lot into the direction that I will take some of my deck building. These reinforce some, I think, good habits for us to be aware of. And another thing, too, that I want to emphasize here as well when looking over it is that, frankly, with my data here, with a total over the past 2 years, about 28% of my games that I play ending due to some type of life loss or burn effect. Frankly, I think that I might be biasing some of my own numbers there because I play a lot of aristocrats. so if anything, I almost worry that I'm overrepresenting how much a blood artist type of win condition is actually present in this data. I don't know that necessarily for sure, but that's also possible. So frankly, it could be even higher than that. So just be conscious of how are games actually ending around you and how can your own deck building respond to that. I think that's maybe one of the most actionable pieces of advice that we have in episodes like this. So if folks clicked away from the YouTube or stopped listening too early, you're missing out on one of the coolest pieces of data in our entire thing when we're going over these, y'all.
Yeah, and this is one of those things I really want to track myself because this is really, really interesting, I think, and kind of shows you what the format looks like in a really easy snapshot. So since we've been talking about all our stats, this might be a good time to move into challenge some other stats.
Sure, yeah, can do. There's a lot more information to get into in the second half of the episode, but you're right, we've hit our midpoint. Let's challenge those stats. This episode's also brought to you by Archidect, an amazing deck building website with the best playtester in the game. Seriously, give that playtester a look if you haven't already. It's top notch and so intuitive. The way that things can be moved and grouped and copied, and even adding extra counters to all of your stuff is a total cinch. You know you love playtesting before you commit to buying any cards, and Archidect makes that super, super easy. And whenever I'm updating decks, whether I'm importing a whole list of cards or just adding a handful here and there, it is super easy to do because you can actually drag and drop cards from Scryfall or from EDHREC directly into your deck on Archidect, and they will load into your deck super fast. That is so dang cool. Give archidect.com a look. That's ARCHIDEKT.com. Genuinely my favorite deck building website. Can't recommend it enough. So I'll start us off with Challenge the Stats this week, and with the release of Magic Foundations, we've seen a whole bunch of new cat cards introduced to the format. New Arabo the First Fang, for instance. There's a whole bunch of extra, cool cat stuff that you can put into a cat deck, which has had me interested in the original Arabo, Roar of the World. The Selesnya Eminent Cat Commander that will pump up your cats even from the command zone. I have to imagine that there are a couple of folks out there who are looking for some room in their Arabo deck to make room for all of those new cats that just came out. And that's why I want to look at a card that I think is kind of overplayed in an Arabo deck, and that's Oreskos Explorer, which I believe came in the Arabo Precon, so that's probably why it's still there. It is a 2-mana 2/2 cat scout. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for up to X plains cards, where X is the number of players who control more lands than you. Reveal those cards, put them into your hand, and then you shuffle the deck. Showing up in 47% of the about 6,900 Arabo decks that are out there right now. This is a fine card, not my favorite way to get mana reliability, even in mono white. And I get that, yes, it is a cat, but it's kind of only okay. And let's be real with ourselves here. This is a green-white deck. The number of players who control more lands than you may not always be reliably very high. I think this card is going to work best in mono-white, and even then, I still don't love it there. I think this card is overplayed, and if you are looking for room in your Arabo deck to make for all of the new cats that you want to play from Magic Foundations, one of my first cuts would be this card. I don't think it needs to show up in nearly half of the Arabo decks that are still out there.
Well, my listener challenge this week was sent to us by Jacob Floth. And Jacob wants to challenge a card for Krenko, Baron of Tin Street. This Krenko, 2 and a red for a 3/3 goblin with haste. And Krenko has an ability, you can tap it to sacrifice an artifact and put a +1 counter on each goblin you control. And then whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can spend one red mana. And if you do, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that gains haste until the end of turn. Jacob wants to challenge the card Cathodion and its more expensive cousin Su-Chi in Krenko decks. Cathodion is an artifact creature for 3 mana, but when it dies, you add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool. Su-Chi does something similar. He says he's confounded by the lack of Cathodion or its more expensive cousin in most of the Baron deck lists on EDHREC, and it's in less than 1% of our decks in the database. Because Cathodion acts as a free anthem. When you sacrifice it, it puts a counter on all of your goblins and refunds the mana you spent to cast it, or you cast it and use it on the next turn and wind up with a giant amount of mana, more than you would have had, functioning kind of as a Black Lotus on that turn for a huge turn. It's a cheap card that's readily available, and it's underplayed in sacrifice decks. And I would tend to agree. If you're playing Krenko, the ability to kind of bank your mana up to play this, use a next turn to buff your goblins, and have a huge amount of mana to take a really big turn is pretty useful, and it definitely should be in more than 1% of decks. So thank you, Jacob.
All right, good stuff. And now, Dana, let's get a little more granular with our personal numbers. We stated up top of the show our total win percentages, but that figure has a lot to do with which decks we played the most and played the least this year, and which individual decks had the highest and lowest win percentages. So, for instance, to add more texture to your total win percentage, it looks like the decks that you played the most this year were also the decks that you won with the most this year, whereas my decks with the best win percentages were some of the decks that I played the least this year. So, I'm interested to hear more about what we play and how they do to help us unpack more of what all goes into our total end of year number, and also what trends they reveal about us as players or about player behavior in general. Because getting right into it, it kind of seems like the strongest trend was simply that how new a deck was affected us a lot this year.
Yeah, you get a situation where, at least for me, so I'll build a new deck, and my most played decks this year were Caliphate and Agnes, the Dragon's Lash, 2 of my newer decks, 2 of my 4 newest decks, I would say. The ones that are newer, I just haven't had a chance to, they're so new, I haven't had a chance to play them as much. So I want to play them because they're new and they're exciting and fun because it's a new toy, which means you probably, in my case, which means I tinker with them more than I do with another deck.
Right.
Tweak things here or there, which makes decks better, even if you're not swapping out busted cards into a slot with something weak. You're still making little changes that synergistically tend to add up. And because you play the deck more often, you just get better at playing that deck.
Sure. And I want to be clear here, too. You named Caliphate and Agnes. Caliphate is a deck that contains only permanents. You don't have any instants or sorceries in the deck.
Yeah.
Every card has to contribute to her mono blue devotion. And your Agnes deck, that's not a Jund deck even. It's a mono red haste deck.
Yes.
And that's another thing, too. These are decks that have pretty big restrictions. But how much did you play them and how much did they win, Dana?
Yeah. So Caliphate, I played 52 games and had just under a 60% win rate that won 59% of the games I played.
Oof.
In Agnes, I played 35 games and I won 43% of those games.
Yeah. So that's a lot. Yeah. And to be clear, I have some decks that have, really good win percentages too, but they're ones that I've played a whole lot less often this year. Mm-hmm. But it definitely matches up with my experience, what you were talking about. Some of my most played decks of this year were decks that I just built this year. I've had my winter deck for a really short amount of time. I've already played 10 games with it.
Sure.
My Marina Vendrell, big restriction on that one, all haunted house theme cards in that deck. I've played that one 10 times as well. And I also built a deck that I call Dr. Whomst, which is where the Doctor regenerates every time that it dies. I go from the 9th Doctor to the 10th Doctor and then to the 11th. It's silly. And I played that one 10 times too. Those are not my most played decks of the year. My most played are my traditional Baba Saga. Played 13 games with that. My Commander deck. I played 13 games with that. And the win percentages are pretty good. None of those are approaching necessarily the same numbers that you just stated there. But right underneath my traditional decks are the ones that I just built this year. So of course,
yeah,
those are the ones that you want to play. And as it happens, the ones that you just built and that you were most excited to play and tinker with also happen to be really dang good.
Right.
So that, I think, affects a couple of things.
I think, particularly in my case, I think one thing that makes a pretty big difference in winning games for me is because of the power level I tend to play at. So people aren't looking to combo out turn 4 or anything. Games tend to go 8 or 9 turns. I didn't track that, but you tracked it. I didn't. But eyeballing that's roughly, games I play tend to take that long. Because I play relatively unassuming commanders like Caliphate, a uncommon from Theros Beyond Death that's I don't think in more than a couple hundred decks in EDHREC, probably less than that. I haven't checked for a while, but it's not remotely popular. Mm-hmm. Even if people know it's an effective deck, there always winds up being something that's scarier this turn versus, scary in 2 turns. And I think because my particular play style also, and the commanders I choose, tends to give me an advantage in the brackets I tend to play in. There's always going to be something scarier to deal with, even if folks do know my thing is scary. And I think that also helps me a lot. Like if I could swap Calify out with something stronger, and I might well win less games because of that factor.
I think that's actually a huge point. Yeah, is that there are things that are harder to gauge because we see them less often. Mm-hmm. I think an example that you used in last year's video was that you're playing your Asperia deck, which is just all Sphinxes. And when someone had a removal spell available, they were like, yeah, Dana is a problem, but I got to get rid of that Atraxa.
Right.
That was literally a thing that you encountered in game. Your deck's being a little bit less ostentatious than, for instance, a lot of my commanders tend to be. Yeah. You are going to draw less attention, and it turns out that is affecting things quite a lot. For me, I wonder whether there's room for being hey, I know this looks unassuming. This deck packs a punch, in terms of the pregame conversation and knowing what we know now that we've actually tracked these numbers. I wonder if this is the kind of thing that might affect or cause more selection or more preparation for the rest of the table going forward. Maybe I'm not sure how you feel about your own numbers there, but it is kind of a whoa. And for me, these numbers, I don't mean this to say that winning is bad. Winning is great. And if people enjoy the game, then that's awesome. But it is about making sure that there's room for everyone to have fun. And are these the types of numbers that give you any pause or whatever is the thing that we want to try and unpack here?
Sure. Yeah.
So for me, the decks that I played the most this year, I mentioned Babala Saga, 13 games, and my Commander deck, where every card in the deck must say the word Commander on it. I played 13 games with that one too. My Babala Saga win percentage is 38%. I won 5 of the 13 games that I played there, which is, approaching that 40%. All right, cool. That is good. It's my signature deck. I almost wonder is this too much? I don't know. Compared to my Commander deck, that one I only had a 23% win percentage on, which is actually quite a step down from last year, which is maybe when the deck was more new and I was more excited and more feverishly tinkering with the deck.
Sure.
And now I think people have kind of gotten the lay of the land on it, or potentially I've gotten better about saying, hey, this deck is better than I thought it was before games, potentially. I'm not entirely sure. But those ended up being some of my most played decks of the year. That does not mean that they're my most winning decks of the year. And the relationship between how much we played a deck versus how much a deck wins is something that I want to explore with you next. So let's talk about those.
For me, so it's very much kind of I guess it would be an inverse bell curve. The decks I play the most tend to have won the most, and then there's a drop off and then it arcs back up.
Yeah.
Where there's decks that I've played the least that also have tend to won a bunch of games, and that's probably because I'm really good at those decks. They've been really tightly tuned. There's not a lot of weak spots in them. I've been playing them for so long that they tend to have a high win percentage. And as a result, I also I've done this thing. I've kind of figured the deck out. I've played it a bunch. I know it's strong, so I tend to play it less.
That's 100% the case for me too. My Titania deck is actually, I only played 1 game with it all year, but I did win that game.
Yeah.
And that was also my least played of the previous year. I only played 3 games of it in 2023. But when I play Titania, everyone knows that's a game that we're here to win it. Sure. And I haven't lost a game with her over the past 2 years of just the 4 games I've played with her. But I've only played her 4 times over the past 2 years. But that's because I know she's here to play.
Yeah. I played my Recce deck 3 times last year, and it was I won 2 games, lost 1 game. And same thing. I love that deck, but it feels very strong at this point. I've played it a ton. There's just a bunch of reasons. I just don't play it because of that. Whereas if you went back to 2016, and I don't remember if I was tracking stats back then, but I guarantee that was one of my most played decks at the time because it was new. I was really enjoying it. I was constantly tweaking it, all the things we said, and now it's on the other end of the curve.
Yeah, I think I've been going on a similar journey with my Conrad deck. It's actually another one of the decks that I played the least. I only played 3 games with it this year, where compared to 2023, I played a bunch more. But also compared to 2023, it actually won more this year. Of the 3 games that I played, it won 2 of the 3. It's a 66% win percentage from just this year. But also adding in the numbers from the year before that, it's going to average out to something probably a little bit more sensible than just this small sliver will actually show. But that is the thing that I find myself very interested in is a lot of the decks that I noticed I tend to win a lot with. My Vohar deck, for instance, is another. It's just classic Reanimator. And that thing was a lot better than I expected it to be when I first built it in 2023. And this year I only played it like 4 times and it won half of those games. Trying to find the right places to play these decks that are not quite competitive, but also maybe not quite casual. That is, I think, the challenge that I'm like trying to find, because I do want to play some of these decks more often, but I don't want them to just sweep every single time. And that is an interesting thing to kind of go into there. That's just sort of the frequency of these, though. I am kind of curious. Are these, what are our winningest decks of the year overall? Does this pattern lay out for every single one of our winningest decks of the year?
Yeah, I mean, it pretty much does for me. Discounting the deck that I just built and literally played for the first time last night. So it's got 1 game under my belt and I won my first game with it. I'll ignore that. It's a brand new deck that, you know, is something that is too new to really care about. But yeah, like the 3 decks I have that had 60%-ish win rates, I played 1 and 3 and 9 games with respectively. So like I just didn't play those decks very much. And they're also decks that are probably, I would say, closing in on 10 years old, all of them.
Sure.
So they're just decks that like I have relentlessly tinkered with and tweaked and both kind of figured out the kind of optimal version of the deck I want to be playing, and I just know how to play them. Like I just have gotten so many reps over the years that I just know how to play those decks. Is that the same thing for you?
Well, it's funny that you say 9. You played 9 games, one of them, because 9 is a high number compared to my paltry number of games that I played this year compared to yours. Yeah, overall, I would say that. I named Titania and Conrad already. I played very few, only 1 in 3 games. I also borrowed other people's decks this year. That is another. I borrowed decks 3 times in games this year, and I won 2 of those 3 games. So, yay, another 66% figure, but like, let's be real, that sample size is teensy. Right. And then I also named a couple of others, like my Vohar deck, my Thalys deck, my Mimeoplasm deck as well. I only played 4 games with each of those. They each won twice, so 50% for this year, I suppose. But yeah, the decks that I do know, like I am more hyper aware of their power. It does feel like, just looking over my own numbers, I'm like, dang, I don't have as many opportunities to play these as I thought I did, do I? And that's, I don't know if like sad is the feeling that I'm feeling about that, but it is kind of like, I need to let's figure that out for 2025. And there's certainly almost an inverse pattern for my losingest decks of 2024, which I did play a little bit more frequently. My Karazakar deck is the deck that I won the least with over 2024, but I played 8 games with it. I only won 1 of them, 12.5% win percentage there. But man, do I enjoy playing Karazakar, and winning that game is like, who cares? I just get to goad things and draw cards and draw cards. So like, it doesn't need to be amazing. My new Marina Haunted House theme deck, I played her 10 times, won 2 of them. You know, still pretty close to the average. That's actually perfectly fine. But like, I don't care if she wins games. That's not what she's there for. She's there for a very silly experience, because I'm playing like weird haunted TV screens and chandeliers and floors and walls and stuff like that, because it's a house deck. So that is kind of an interesting relationship for me to observe, is like which decks I do play the most, as you mentioned, kind of the inverse bell curve. You know, my Babala Saga, pretty good win percentage on that. Then some other decks that I do play the most because I just enjoy them, but they tend to lose a lot. And then my decks that do win the most, I tend not to play them at all, but dang, is their win percentage high. And that's a very weird thing to observe, I guess.
Well, and this is not something I've spent much time thinking about, because like literally it's occurred to me in the last 2 minutes as we're talking and I'm listening to you talk here. One thing that I do, and I'm going to bet this is largely true of you, we tend to not brew decks in the first place, or at least bring them out and play them until we're pretty convinced they're going to play well.
Sure.
And I don't know if that's true of most people. Like a lot of times when I'm out in the wild, I'll be playing someone. I'm like, oh yeah, I just built this deck. I thought this commander looked cool, or this just came out and I just threw it together last night. That's not a thing I do. Mm-hmm. Like I tend to tinker with decks for months and months, if not, like I've done it for years sometimes before I put a deck together. I think that also makes a difference. There's lots of folks that just like on a whim throw a deck together, or take a pre-con and pull out a few cards, put new cards in, and you know that deck might go out and lose a bunch of games early on because of that. We don't do that either. That definitely, I at least I don't, and I'm pretty sure you don't. You tend to think about the decks a lot before you build them as well, and I think that makes a difference. Like out of the gate, we have decks that come out that play like we've had them for 6 months, because we kind of have. Compared to other people, I don't think that's something most people do.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. What are your losingest decks of this past year? I'm kind of curious. And how often you played them.
My losingest decks, Athreos Shroud Veiled was 20% win rate. That's a Pestilence deck, so it's like really narrow. Glissa Sunslayer, 26%. Played 27 games because that was a new deck this year. And Glissa Herald of Predation, the newest Glissa, only 7 games, but that was 28% win rate. So my third losingest deck was still above a quarter.
You got to stop saying only 7 games. 7 was a lot for me for some of my decks this year, Dana.
Yeah.
There's some decks that I only played 6 times, okay? Some decks I only played 3 times. Like, come on, man.
So you're saying the average person isn't playing like almost a game a day?
No, yeah, your numbers are crazy high, dude. That's wild. Yeah, it's very interesting to witness those patterns, and that's something that I definitely want to observe more critically in the year to come, about like finding more room to play some of these, because I wish that I had played my Thalys deck more often this year, for instance. I wish that I had gotten more opportunities to play Vohar or things like that. And I'm sure that you feel the same way about some of the decks that you didn't get a whole lot of room to play.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you didn't enjoy the other decks that you did play more often, especially those that had that new deck energy to them. But like, I guess looking at these numbers at the end of the year is a very interesting feeling, because you don't notice a lot of these things during the year.
Right.
It took me like 3 years to realize, when I had an Elegith deck, that I had only played it 1 time over the past 3 years. And like, oh, why do I have that then? Like, those are the things that kind of only you notice when you actually like log these things down and take a real frank look at the numbers. And I think that's kind of the moment that we're in with looking over all of these.
Yeah, very much so. So having looked at all of this data and like thought about your decks and your win percentages and all this stuff over the course of the year, is there anything that you want to change or do differently with your list going into 2025?
How my decks compared this year to last year and how those numbers average out overall is what's most interesting to me now. For instance, seeing that I've consistently had an above average win rate both years whenever I play precons or borrow decks, that's kind of interesting. Is that a sign that I pick up new strategies pretty quickly? I don't know. Maybe so. I might dig more into that. Or I mentioned my Conrad deck had a big change in numbers from this year to last. It lost more games more often last year, but it won more this year. But I also only played 3 games with it this year. So what does that even really mean?
Sure.
But averaging out all the games it played from the past 2 years combined, I found that it actually has the same overall win percentage as my Barakos deck, 37% each, even though those decks are obviously being played in very different circles. Conrad's one of the biggest movers I noticed across both years, and my Rayhan deck was too. It won a quarter of its games last year, but then 40% of its games this year, but it averages out to 30% total across both years, so that's pretty in line with my usual rate.
Yeah.
And another one that took a lot of my attention is my Wilhilt Zombie deck. It only won 22% of its games last year, but then this year I won 33% of my games with it, averaging out both years to being just above a 25% win rate total for its nearly 30 games that I've played with it. And the reason I'm naming each one of those is because Conrad and Rayhan and Wilhilt are each decks that I've been trying to tweak and tune up for a while now. So with 2 years of data, I think I can take that as a sign that, hey, these tune-ups have indeed been working out.
Sure.
And on the flip side of all that, now that I've seen that my 2 worst performing decks are consistently Karazakar and Virtus for 2 years in a row, each with only about a 16% win rate total across both years, that's perhaps a sign for me to see whether I like those decks where they're at, or if it's worth tuning them up at all. So yeah, these total averages are a lot more informative and helpful at giving me overall patterns to spot, in addition to the new deck energy thing that we mentioned, where I also want to make sure that I am making room to play old favorites and that I'm not just putting all of my attention on any new decks that I build. So yeah, that's where my brain is at moving into next year. Kind of a lot from me. So now let's flip that question back around on you. What is on your mind looking over all of your numbers?
So the one thing that jumped out at me looking through my deck list before this show was, while I don't really run fast mana, I didn't have any Crypts or Blue Lotuses to pull out after the ban. I'm not running, Mox Diamond or Chrome Mox or any of those kind of things. I still have, because I had the cards years ago, I still have a handful of Ancient Tombs in decks.
Oh, sure.
So a land that I can tap for 2 mana. Now, I'm not running a ton of, mana rocks necessarily either. I have half a dozen in a lot of my decks, but Ancient Tomb isn't necessarily enabling like turn 1 Ancient Tomb into Signet kind of things very often. but it's also one of those cards that reputationally has turned into the kind of thing that people see and assume there's power coming with the deck. And so that's a thing that I can tune down. Like, I'm always looking for knobs that I can turn on a deck to tune it down a little bit. And that's a really easy one. I'll just pull those last 2 Ancient Tombs out of decks. So I'm just going to probably do a go over, over Christmas break here and look at all my lists and be like, is there kind of a pattern of things that I can tune down that will cover all of them? Something like removing the remaining Ancient Tombs from decks, stuff of that nature. So like, I'm going to look to do those kind of blanket changes to lists overall. So I can take those kind of things out that are still in a couple of my lists.
I wonder too if there's almost a relationship or a correlation there going on, that like when you have a deck that you have detuned and detuned and detuned, then when you actually get into a game, does that make you more scrappy? And I almost wonder whether that's something that has affected any numbers in any which way. It's just like, well, I know this deck isn't playing the big stuff. That doesn't mean I'm not going to play it like Total Cutthroat or anything. Right. I'm not sure whether, but like, I don't know. That's a question that entered my head as you were talking about some of those things. Like, is there a possibility that, like, when you are playing more of those obvious things, that affects how not only your opponents see your battlefield and evaluate the threats on your field and don't allow you to go under the radar as much, but does that also affect how you feel about playing the game too, and the scrappiness with which you play that game? So that's just kind of a question that hit me as you were talking there.
So there's 2 things that I have noticed in regards to this. So yes, I think the lack of, particularly of really splashy effective cards, the Fierce Guardianship and Ancient Tomb would count. They're cards that, like, people, when they see them, they're aware that something strong is occurring. Mm-hmm. I think the less of those you have in the deck, absolutely the more you fly under the radar. Even if your deck is performing really well, people still like look for those signposts, and when they don't see them, they tend to underestimate what you're doing. So I think there's an edge that comes with doing that as well. I would say the negative thing that happens, though, is like, as somebody who's removed all his rifts and removed almost all his tutors and things of that nature, that then you feel frustrated when you sit at a pod and things are going really close and you're like, I think I can turn the corner and win this game next turn, and then someone tutors up a rift or whatever, right? Like, does something, you're like, oh, I could have done that too and locked out this game, but I like chosen to scale my power back and not run those things, and because I made that choice, I'm gonna lose this game. Like, that gets a little bit frustrating too. So it's a matter of trying to find that balance between like not running those strong things and also like depower. You don't want to depower yourself to the point where it feels like you've given a game away as well.
I think one other thing that hits me in this too is that when I look over the totality of when I've summed up all of the decks, their win percentages across 2023 and 2024, a thing that I do notice about my decks that win the most is how out of nowhere their win conditions can actually be, and how much of an asset that ends up being.
Yes.
The deck that has won the most for me across all the 2 years I've been doing this, it's only 4 games, but my Titania deck has not lost a game among them. And it isn't just that I am playing her scrappy, I'm playing her to win. I know what she's capable of. Like, I do enter into those games saying that to the whole group and also with that mentality myself. But the amount of damage that Titania can produce out of nowhere when you sacrifice all of your lands, she makes all those things, and then you drop a Concordant Crossroads, which people don't expect from green. Just suddenly all these tokens are hasty.
Sure.
Or I have an Eldrazi Monument and you didn't expect green to be flying. Now, did you? Stuff like that. It has an out of nowhere component that I think is one of my biggest assets in there. My Mimeoplasm deck, it has an overall 60% win percentage based off of the past 2 years. That one also can create some out of nowhere, oh, I didn't expect that combination of creatures that he had in his graveyard would be quite as lethal as it is.
Right.
Suddenly your creatures are present and hasty, or suddenly your creatures are way bigger than I thought they were going to be. My Thalys deck, I've got 5 tokens. Oh, crap, you just played a Moonshaker Cavalry. Now they're huge. That out of nowhere aspect is a huge asset for a lot of the decks that I have, and the way that they're able to win, compared to like my losingest deck of the entire year is Karazakar. Not just of the entire year, of the past 2 years. And Karazakar is a lot more gradual. It's a lot more what's in play is what's in play. You are going to see this coming. And that gives people the chance to pay attention, to prepare for it, to always know exactly where I stand. And I think that's kind of the thing for me to also take away from this is being aware of how much of a threat I am showing versus how much of it is a surprise. And therefore making me be sure to keep that in mind for the other players that I play against. And so being prepared for that in my own games and when my opponents will have those surprises too, seems to me like the biggest lesson of the year.
Well, and I'll just briefly go back to your comment about scrappiness too, with playing with that a little bit underpowered deck. Like my best friend in high school, we played a lot of one-on-one basketball together. And at one point, one summer, I think his senior year, he broke, I can't remember if it was a wrist or his tibia or whatever it was, but he had to wear a cast on his right hand. So he spent the entire summer playing basketball left-handed against me. And he was we were pretty evenly matched until he spent an entire summer using his left hand and was a much better basketball player against me at that point because he gained the ability to shoot with either hand.
Sure.
I think if you are playing those scrappier decks, you learn to use tools that you're never forced to use when the Dragon is your commander. Or whatever, like very obviously, very linear, very powerful commander you could be playing. I do think there are advantages to playing those decks with weaker commanders and with weaker cards. Not only do you fly into the radar, you just have to learn to use tools that like you never have to learn to use when you can always go with your right hand.
Sure. Yeah. I can absolutely see the logic for that. But there is still, our responsibility to make sure that we hold ourselves to it. Like we've upgraded and leveled up like a whole bunch. And there are still a lot of ways for us to make sure that we're playing right, I guess. These are important.
So it's a good experience for everyone involved.
Yeah, absolutely. Dana, these are some of my favorite types of episodes to do all year. Going over all this information is really interesting. I am still a little begrudging that you have played so many more games than I have. But in my defense, I've tracked a whole lot more than you have. So maybe next year we can meet each other in the middle like a little bit.
We'll see. Yep, for sure.
All right, cool. Listeners out there, I hope you've really enjoyed going over all of this data with us. There's actually even more data that I'll probably dig into in a bonus episode, so watch out on the YouTubes for that. Maybe also watch out for whether we'll have a version of our spreadsheets available to potentially as a Patreon perk. Who knows what that will look like in the future. But I'm excited to dig into even more of this in the coming year. And listeners, if you are at all engaged in a project like this, you got to let us know about it for you as well.
Yes.
And any tips or tricks that you have for tracking this so that Dana can track all of that information with ease instead of with difficulty.
Yeah.
But that's going to call this one to a close. So Dana, where do our listeners get in touch with us if they want to find us online?
You can find me online where skies are blue at Dana Roach. And you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Joey Schultz. You can find me online everywhere, places like Blue Sky, Instagram at Joseph M. Schultz online. You can also find the cast everywhere online at EDHRECast. Plus, if you've got a question for us, you can contact us at EDHRECast@gmail.com. Listeners, we'll be back at you next week with even more data and insights. But until then, remember, EDHREC your deck before you wreck your deck.